My boss took credit for my work, smirked, "Get used to it." I quietly left. And now I'm his biggest rival. If you'd told me 10 years ago that I'd end up sitting across from Marco Armento in a smoky dive bar, plotting to take down my old boss, I'd have laughed in your face. But that's the thing about life, it has a way of tossing curveballs when you least expect them. And in my case, that curveball's name was Scott Frazier. The story starts a few years back, at Harrison & Beck's, a big-name marketing firm based right here in Chicago. I'd been there 10 years, my life wrapped up in the familiar rhythm of spreadsheets, presentations, and endless client meetings. I'd been around long enough to earn respect, and I'd poured my heart into that place. I thought we were all on the same team. But then Scott happened. Scott Frazier, our newly minted creative director, arrived out of nowhere. The guy looked like he'd stepped out of a men's fashion magazine, chiseled jaw, sleek suits, the works. He had this smooth way about him, a confidence that seemed to pour off him in waves. And as I soon learned, he had an uncanny ability to talk his way into, and out of, just about anything. He walked in with this aura like he was some kind of savior who'd lead us all to greatness. At first, I respected him. I thought he was the type of guy who could elevate our work, you know? But I quickly learned that Scott's game was mostly smoke and mirrors. He had a knack for taking credit and playing people off each other, and somehow, no one seemed to catch on. The breaking point came with the Lakeview project. The Lakeview Group was one of our biggest clients, luxury real estate, high-end developments, the whole 9 yards. They'd been looking for a rebranding, something that would refresh their image in a market saturated with big names. I was all over it, working late nights, pulling in ideas from every corner I could think of. For 6 months, I ate, slept, and breathed that project. Even Rachel, my wife, could barely get my attention most evenings. "Dan, you know they pay you the same if you don't work all night," she'd joke as I sat hunched over my laptop on the living room couch, strung out on caffeine. I know, I'd reply, waving her off. But this could be big for us. For me, you know? The thing about Rachel is that she never pushes me unless she really needs to. And she always has my back, no matter what. So she'd just give me a nod, pat my shoulder, and let me get back to it. Finally, the night of the big pitch arrived. I had rehearsed every slide, every line. Scott was supposed to introduce me, then let me take the reins since I'd done all the work. But just as we were about to walk into the conference room, Scott stopped me, flashing that shark-like grin of his. "Listen, Dan," he said, patting my shoulder. "I'll lead this one. You just hang back and support, all right?" I froze, staring at him. "Scott, what do you mean?" "I'm leading the pitch. I put this whole thing together," I stammered, caught completely off guard. Yeah, I know," he said, waving it off like it was no big deal. "But sometimes you gotta just go with the flow, man. Trust me, I've got this." He smirked, as if daring me to challenge him. I felt my hands ball into fists, but something inside me told me not to cause a scene. Not here. Not now. So I went along with it, gritting my teeth as Scott sauntered into the room and launched into the pitch as though every idea, every slide, every painstaking detail was his own. The room was hanging on his every word. He was smooth, I'll give him that, but it felt like he was twisting a knife in my chest with every word he spoke. The bastard was good at this. Too good. When he wrapped up, the clients were practically throwing contracts at him. He smiled, shook their hands, and turned back to me as the clients filed out. "See? Not bad, huh?" he said, flashing that grin. "Sometimes you just gotta let go and let things happen, Dan. Get used to it. Get used to it." He said it so casually, like stealing credit for months of my work was just a small favor he was doing me. I couldn't even respond. I just turned and left, feeling like the ground had fallen out from under me. I stumbled back to my office, closed the door, and just stared at the walls. I was so angry I felt nauseous. 10 years of loyalty, 10 years of pouring my soul into my work, and this is how they repay me? When I finally got home that night, I could barely keep it together. Rachel was waiting up for me, concern etched into her face as soon as she saw me. "Dan, what happened?" she asked, touching my arm gently. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Scott. He took the whole presentation. He didn't let me say a word. Just swiped it right out from under me, Rach." She was silent for a moment, then she pulled me into a hug. "You don't have to stay there, you know," she said softly. "It's 10 years of my life, Rach. It's not that simple." She looked up at me, her face calm but determined. "Maybe it's not simple, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. They don't deserve you if this is how they treat you. You don't have to stay somewhere that tears you down." I sat with her words all night, tossing and turning in bed. And the next morning, as I looked around my office and saw the faces of people I'd known for a decade, I knew she was right. By lunchtime, I'd written up my resignation. Scott didn't bother with a pep talk or even an apology, he just looked vaguely annoyed. "Dan, come on, don't be dramatic. You know how these things go, he said, leaning back in his chair, his arms folded. Over one pitch? Really? One pitch? I echoed, laughing bitterly. Scott, this isn't the first time you've done this. It's just the last time I'll let you get away with it. For the first time, his smirk faltered. Just for a split second, but then he chuckled, shaking his head as if he pitied me. All right, Mitchell. Good luck out there. You'll be back. But I wasn't. I spent the next few weeks networking harder than I ever had in my life. I reached out to anyone I'd ever worked with, trying to figure out what was next. Then one day, I got a call from Marco, an old colleague who'd left the firm a few years back. Scott had done to him what he'd just done to me, and Marco had enough sense to get out before it got worse. When we met up for coffee, he didn't waste any time. So I heard you finally saw the light, he said with a grin. Yeah, you could say that, I replied, rolling my eyes. Listen, I've got this idea, he said, leaning forward, lowering his voice. You and me, why don't we start something ourselves? We've both got the experience, the connections. We don't need Scott. I stared at him, part of me excited, the other part terrified. Marco, starting our own agency? That's a huge leap. Marco shrugged. So what? We've got the brains, we know the business, and hell, if Scott can make it, we sure as hell can. The idea of being my own boss was tantalizing. I'd spent years bowing to people like Scott, letting them pull the strings while I did the heavy lifting. What if I could call the shots for once? After a long talk with Rachel, I knew I had to give it a shot. The worst thing that could happen was that it wouldn't work out, and at least I'd have tried. So we started M&M Strategies. At first, it was just me, Marco, and a tiny office with barely enough space for both of us. We took on any client we could get, even small-time projects that barely paid the bills. But every project we took, we poured everything into it. We weren't going to be another Harrison and Bex, we were going to be different. Honest. Transparent. Months passed, and slowly but surely, our client list grew. We started landing contracts, and one by one, we watched as clients who'd been with Scott for years started drifting over to us. And it felt good. It felt damn good. 2 years in, we'd become a real force to be reckoned with. Then, one day, I got an email about the Lakeview project. They were looking to rebrand again and were inviting us to pitch. I couldn't believe it, the very project Scott had stolen from me was back on the table, and they were inviting us. Full circle, man, Marco said when I told him, laughing. Let's show Scott how it's done. The day of the pitch arrived, and I walked into the Lakeview boardroom with Marco by my side. And who should be sitting across from us, a few seats down, but Scott. He gave me this look, this smug, disbelieving look, like he couldn't believe I had the nerve to be there. But I ignored him, focusing on the presentation, giving it everything I had. I could feel the energy in the room, the clients nodding along, genuinely excited. And when we finished, they offered us the contract on the spot. As we walked out, Scott approached me, trying to keep his expression neutral. Well, he said, forcing a laugh. I guess you two managed to cobble something together after all. I smiled, calm as I'd ever been. Yeah, Scott. Sometimes you just have to go with the flow. He glared at me, but I didn't care. The victory was mine, fair and square. And for the first time in years, I felt free. Running my own agency wasn't easy. It was a grind, it was exhausting, and there were nights I'd lie awake wondering if I'd made a huge mistake. But then I'd think of Scott, his face when we landed the Lakeview account, the way he'd tried to brush me aside like I didn't matter. Rachel was there for every step, cheering me on, reminding me of why I'd left. She'd seen the fire that Scott had tried to snuff out and helped me bring it back to life. And Scott? Well, he's still at Harrison and Beck's, last I heard. Holding on to whatever scraps he can. It's funny, I thought I'd feel more satisfaction knowing that. But in the end, the best revenge wasn't beating him. The best revenge was building something of my own, something real, something that didn't rely on stepping on anyone else to get there. Marco likes to say, revenge is a dish best served with success. And if Scott's reading this, I'll say it one last time, get used to it. Months after landing the Lakeview project, Marco and I had settled into a rhythm with our agency, M&M Strategies. We had a steady stream of clients, a team of dedicated employees, and we were finally moving out of our cramped little office into a space with actual windows and enough desks for everyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Scott wasn't done. Sure enough, a few weeks after we'd wrapped up the Lakeview launch, Marco walked into my office, holding his phone, looking slightly concerned. Dan, you're gonna want to see this, he said, passing me his phone. It was an email from one of our clients, Sylvia Brown from Hartwell Financial. Sylvia was one of our biggest accounts, and we'd worked hard to secure her business. The email was polite but to the point. Hartwell Financial would be exploring other options, and she'd be returning to work with Harrison and Beck's. Marco shook his head, crossing his arms. She told me personally how much she valued the transparency we offered her. This isn't adding up. I didn't need to ask what he was implying. I knew Scott had been making moves behind the scenes, likely offering a deal he could barely afford just to lure clients back. He wasn't just losing business to us, he was feeling the sting, and he couldn't stand it. The rest of the day was tense. Marco and I held a team meeting, reviewing all our active clients, calling each of them to touch base, ensuring there were no other surprises waiting for us. Most clients were steadfast, but a few mentioned having been contacted by Scott or his team, hinting that Harrison and Bex had been slinging mud behind our backs. That night, Rachel could tell something was eating at me. "Scott's pulling his tricks again, huh?" she asked, sitting beside me on the couch, watching as I scrolled through emails on my laptop. "Yeah. He's desperate," I muttered. "Trying to take down our clients by any means possible. I thought once we landed Lakeview, he'd back off, but now he's angling to tear us apart." Rachel gave my hand a squeeze. "Dan, he's running scared. He knows he can't win, so he's trying to rattle you. You've already proven you can beat him on talent and integrity. Don't stoop to his level." She was right, as usual. But it wasn't that simple. Scott's antics weren't just a minor annoyance, they were a direct threat to everything we'd built. I had a team to support now, and every lost client affected not just Marco and me but everyone who relied on us. A week later, I got a call from the Lakeview Group's CEO, David Green. David wasn't a man who wasted time, and I could tell by the urgency in his voice that something was wrong. "Dan," he said, skipping right over the pleasantries, "I need to know something. Did you or anyone at M&M Strategies disclose confidential information about our Lakeview launch plan to Harrison and Bex?" "What? No, absolutely not," I replied, heart racing. "David, we would never breach that trust. Why would you think that?" David paused, sighing heavily. "Because Scott just walked into a pitch meeting with our competition, pitching almost the exact same branding strategy you presented to us. I don't know how he got it, but he was able to recite every detail like he'd been the one who developed it. I felt my stomach drop. Scott had somehow gotten hold of our pitch, the one we'd worked on tirelessly, the one we'd won fair and square. But how? I swear to you, David, this is news to me. We keep everything secure here. I'll get to the bottom of this." Hanging up, I paced my office, seething. This wasn't just a cheap shot, this was sabotage. Scott had somehow accessed our work and was using it to go after our clients. Marco came in, hearing the commotion, and I explained the call. He shook his head, jaw clenched. "This guy's got no limits, Dan. He's crossing lines he can't walk back from. We can't just let this slide." But this wasn't a problem that could be solved with a confrontation. Scott wasn't just playing dirty, he was actively undermining us, which meant we had to handle this legally. It was time to call in a lawyer. A few days later, I found myself sitting across from a woman named Helen Gates, a no-nonsense intellectual property attorney who came highly recommended. Helen listened to my story, her sharp eyes narrowing as I described Scott's tactics. "Dan," she said, leaning back in her chair, "if Scott is using your proprietary work to steal clients, you have grounds to pursue action. But you'll need evidence. Emails, document history, anything that proves he had access to that presentation." "We keep everything password protected," Marco said, looking as baffled as I felt. "No one outside the agency should have been able to get their hands on that presentation." Helen nodded. "Then I suggest a forensic IT audit. If he hacked your system or if there was a leak, we'll find it." I left her office feeling a strange mix of dread and relief. Part of me wanted to confront Scott directly, to demand answers, but I knew that wasn't the way forward. This was bigger than a simple feud. Scott had crossed into illegal territory, and now it was about protecting everything Marco and I had worked to build. The audit took a week. A tense, painful week. Finally, Helen called us back with the findings. "It appears your suspicions were correct," she said, placing a document in front of us. "There was unauthorized access to your systems. Based on the IP address, it appears the access came from none other than Harrison and Beck's network." My blood boiled. Scott hadn't just tried to one-up us, he'd blatantly violated our security, risking our clients, our work, our reputation. "What are our options?" Marco asked, sounding angrier than I'd ever heard him. Helen's expression was calm but resolute. "You have a case for corporate espionage, and if we proceed, it could be devastating for Harrison and Beck's. But be warned, it'll be a public battle. You need to be sure this is what you want." I sat back, considering the weight of her words. Taking legal action meant going public, dragging both Scott and Harrison and Bex through the mud. It would be messy, ugly, and it wouldn't be a quick win. But there was no way I could let him get away with this. "Yes," I said, looking her dead in the eyes. "I'm sure. He didn't just hurt me, he hurt my team, our reputation. Let's do it." The next few months were a whirlwind of depositions, paperwork, and tense meetings. Scott tried to worm his way out of it, of course, denying everything, claiming he'd had no idea how his team had gotten access to our work. But the evidence was damning. With Helen's expertise, we compiled a case so airtight even Scott couldn't talk his way out. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the industry. People who'd once sung Scott's praises now whispered about his underhanded methods. Our clients rallied around us, offering support and condemning Scott's tactics. I got calls from people I hadn't spoken to in years, telling me they'd always suspected something was off about Scott. Finally, the day came for our court hearing. Scott's team tried every tactic in the book to cast doubt on our evidence, to paint us as disgruntled former employees, but it didn't stick. In the end, the judge ruled in our favor, finding Harrison and Bex and Scott liable for intellectual property theft and awarding us damages. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about the victory, the vindication. Scott's smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated look as he walked out of that courtroom. His reputation, once untouchable, was in shambles. As we left the courthouse, Marco turned to me, grinning. "We did it, Dan. We really did it." "Yeah," I replied, taking a deep breath. "We did." Life settled down after that. Our agency continued to grow, bringing in clients who wanted integrity and honesty. We'd built something real, something based on respect and trust. And I was proud of it. Scott, on the other hand, disappeared from the industry. Last I heard, he'd moved out to New York, trying to rebuild his career. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a hint of satisfaction in that, but mostly, I felt a sense of peace. Rachel and I celebrated that night, raising a toast to the end of a long, hard journey. She looked at me with that same proud, steady gaze she'd had when I first left Harrison and Bex. "You did it, Dan," she said, smiling. "You took back your life. No one will ever take that from you again." I smiled, squeezing her hand. She was right. Scott was gone, but more importantly, I'd found my own strength, my own voice. And in the end, that was worth more than any revenge. Looking back now, I realize that everything Scott tried to take from me only made me stronger. He thought he could break me, but all he did was push me towards something better. And if Scott ever reads this, I'll say it one last time. Get used to it.